Welcome to Act and Unwind, an ongoing conversation on a free and virtuous society. I'm your host, Eric Kohn. I want to thank you for listening and ask that if you're listening to us on our website, that you navigate now to the show notes for this episode, where you will find a link to subscribe directly to Act and Unwind at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else where fine podcasts are available. And if you like this program, please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts so as to help more people find our show. This week, I'm joined by Dan Huger, Acton's librarian and a research associate, and Dylan Pahman, executive editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality and a research fellow here at Acton. Today, we will discuss the power of language and, sadly, once again, inflation. But first, I want to grow old. With you guys, but just in general. But I had a thought over this past weekend. Because last week, the real political conversation, or one of the big political conversations, was about did Democrats just discover or at least acknowledge that Joe Biden's age is a particular problem? And I think the impetus for this was Biden just wrapped up a visit to the Middle East, Saudi Arabia. Perhaps later we'll dive into the, exactly how good of an idea is it to be more or less going over there and buddying with the nation of Saudi Arabia? That's a complicated subject, and maybe we'll get into it here. I don't know, but I want to start in a different place, which is there seemed to be an acknowledgement from some quarters that didn't really want to acknowledge it as being an issue. Joe Biden is an old guy. This also comes to the fore because polling suggests that 50% of people Republicans would support Donald Trump if he ran again for the Republican nomination for president. I think that's a somewhat misleading polling number, but set that aside as well. There is the possibility of a 2024 election between two octogenarians. You could have an argument about whether or not Donald Trump seems to have more of his faculties than Joe Biden does. I think we're kind of comparing apples and oranges there because one's definition of, Trump's having his faculties is going to be not the same as another person's definition of it. But I thought this was an interesting question because the line from Jonah Goldberg that I've shamelessly stolen is that we come into this world completely ignorant and only get less so as we get less young. With age comes wisdom. With the experience of having grown old comes wisdom about how the world works. The other way of thinking about it is, how all the things your grandmother told you turned out to be pretty much correct. It wasn't because your grandmother was a visionary. She very well might have been. I've never met either of your grandmothers. I'm sure they were brilliant women. But you've lived that long and you understand how the world works. You learn a lot in that time. But the presidency is a demanding job. Leadership like that is demanding. And there are legitimate questions as to whether or not Joe Biden or Donald Trump would be capable of handling those responsibilities. And it made me think about this connection between age, wisdom, and leadership. How old is too old for a leader? Because we do decline in our older age. I think that is also true. And we have had, we had one of the youngest presidents that we had in Barack Obama. And then we had two of the oldest people to serve as president. Again, keep in mind, I think Reagan was 69 years old when he entered the presidency. He was not nearly as old as Biden and Trump were when they entered the presidency. So I throw that out there for anyone to jump in on this question of this nexus between age, wisdom, and leadership.
So, I think there's a lot that can be said here. It's hard to say it without, painting with too broad of a brush. But, 2008, we had this housing recession crisis, and a lot of baby boomers who were going to retire lost their retirement, and they kept their jobs, and they didn't retire. And same is true of presidents, it turns out. Baby boomers are not given up the presidency. They, I don't know if Trump and Biden had, some mortgage-backed securities that went bottom up, but they really,
it seems like a
really,
decent chance Donald Trump may have.
Yeah.
I know nothing
I would
about
not
this.
be surprised.
That was a joke. It was mostly
given
a joke.
his real estate connections. But it does make me wonder. We have an age minimum for president. You have to be 35 to, I think, be sworn in. I think you could be like, well, I'll turn 35 before January. So, I presume a 34-year-old could run. I think it's at least something we should talk about as a nation about whether there should be an age limit. Perhaps 70. Let's make a 35-year window or something like that. 70 is still pretty old. That would have given us at least one term of Reagan. Kind of like the second term, but I kind of agree with those who think, well, he was declining, in his later years. And then you have a question of, well, who's really in charge, right? Is it the person that all the people voted for? And I think that's a very important question when it comes to legitimacy of democracy. Do we want just appointed officials and, the background people literally running the show? And the person who is actually the president kind of just being, a face and hopefully not a voice, because usually they don't want him to say things in front of a microphone. I think this is a conversation that it's worth having that, as you mentioned, people decline. As one economist famously said, in the long run, we're all dead. And that is true of individuals. We decline. We are mortal. We die. Our faculties deteriorate, and President of the United States is a very important job. It's a very, tiring job. You look at people, younger past presidents, such as Barack Obama, such as George W. Bush, they age terribly by the time they are done. I cannot imagine what that does to a person who has already aged that much. Yeah. So, I think this is a conversation we ought to have.
I throw out as well that one of our problems, not just with regard to the presidency and that 35-year minimum for becoming president of the United States. Also, it's a problem that comes in with policy, enacting policies that have an actual age written into them. And I will give you context for both of those. In the 1770s, 1780s, the average life expectancy of a male was about 38 years old. So now look, if you this anecdote I'm seeing right here, this note I'm seeing right here, that if you made it to your 50th birthday, you could widely expect to live another 21 years. So yes, certainly people lived beyond that, but average life expectancy, again, 38 years, 35 was the minimum for becoming president of the United States. So I think there's something to suggest there that they're looking for some sense of, within their own context, seniority amongst the potential people that could serve as president. I think one of the other problems is what I said with regard to policy, and this is, I think, my worry about writing ages like this into would have to be the Constitution for someone serving as the chief executive. The retirement age, quoting Social Security, right, is what? It's 65. The average life expectancy when Social Security was enacted was 63. So you only started receiving Social Security if you lived 2 years beyond the average life expectancy at the time. The problem with writing things like that are fixed into the law and into Constitution, especially the Constitution, is that the circumstances and the way how long we live has been increasing over time. I have no idea how much further we can potentially stretch it, but there is something to suggest that there could be problems with writing a fixed age like that in.
So one of the issues you have with this as well, and this is an issue, thankfully, we have not had with any of our older presidents, is what happened to Senator Dianne Feinstein earlier this year. She is a very senior member of the Senate. There have been long, persistent rumors of a cognitive decline, and there were some members of her staff and of other senatorial staffs that went on record anonymously, but went on record with a reporter about these concerns. And that would create, I think, a real crisis of legitimacy if that were to happen to a president. If you were to have, let's say, members of their staff, if you were to have people who worked closely in the executive branch go on record with that sort of thing, because then that creates not only we have some of these questions, and a lot of them are sort of politically motivated in domestic politics, but then we also have concerns with how presidents are perceived by foreign leaders, and whether or not the person on the other side of the table, when they're discussing serious international issues, is actually the person in charge. And this is historically the most important and sort of singular role the president plays as the representative of the country in foreign affairs. So I think it's something that I would like to see us come up with a constitutional solution for before we have a constitutional crisis. And we've seen this before with President Roosevelt's 4 terms. There was a long established precedent set by President Washington that there would be, that you would serve 2 terms as president and then walk away. President Theodore Roosevelt tried to upset that apple cart a little bit earlier, was not able to do so, but President Franklin Roosevelt succeeded. And there was a large bipartisan agreement, even though President Roosevelt was an immensely popular president, that we should have term limits for the presidency. And that passed through the normal amendment process. And I hope that after the presidency of President Biden has concluded, that maybe we could have that sort of consensus emerge, and that we could have an upper limit placed on service for the presidency, because I don't think it's fair to these presidents' constituencies either. This is something that's often utilized by political opponents in the case of both President Donald Trump and President Joseph Biden, to criticize them. And while those attacks often lack merit, and there's a partisan animus behind them, I think it is a concern as anyone who supports a president. They support them because they want to be able to see them enact their agenda, represent them effectively. And in cases of advanced age, that's often simply not possible.
Dianne Feinstein is 89 years old. Chuck Grassley, the senator from Iowa, is 88 years old. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, is 82. Maxine Waters, one of the senior members of the Democratic side of the House, is 83 years old. Yes, so I just to point out some of those ages that exist within the senior ranks of leadership of American government.
You also had a problem. Senator Leahy of Vermont, I will never forget this. He was involved in some, I believe it was one of the Supreme Court hearings, because he was on the Senate Judiciary Committee. This was during the coronavirus, and Senator Leahy was, I believe, in his early 90s. I know he's retiring after his current term. But you had, when you have an infectious disease, Senator Leahy was conducting these interviews, was questioning Supreme Court nominees via Zoom, because there was a real health threat to people of advanced age, and that makes you a less effective representative. That makes you a less effective committee member. You're not able to be on the floor with your colleagues in these discussions. And I believe Senator Leahy acted appropriately in realizing that, this is, for someone his age, an extremely dangerous position to be in a room in a public hearing when there is a, very serious respiratory virus going on, when there's a pandemic. But I think that certainly affects effectiveness as legislators and certainly as president.
Pat Leahy, 82 years old, and will, of course, always be remembered for, at least to me, for two things. One, for being on the receiving end of a very colorful remark by then Vice President Dick Cheney on the floor of the Senate. You can Google that if you don't know what I'm talking about. And the other is that he is the older guy threatened by Heath Ledger's Joker in The Dark Knight. He makes a cameo in The Dark Knight at the Penthouse fundraiser for Harvey Dent. So that's what I will always remember Patrick Leahy for.
So movie star.
Yeah,
Patrick
movie star, big
Leahy.
Batman fan, Patrick Leahy. I will just throw out one thing, which is my, and I'll go to you, Dylan, is my objection. I've thought a lot about term limits. I used to do a lot of public policy work before I came here to the Acton Institute. Term limits was always one of those things that was on offer for people looking to reform, especially state government and the way state government works. And my problem with term limits has always been kind of twofold. One, artificially putting a cap, and again, I'm more sympathetic on the presidential end of it than I am on, say, Congress, Senate, and state legislatures, or even state constitutional offices, is politics is a skill. And I think we see a lot of confusion. I was just talking to our producer, Daniel, about this earlier, that because somebody has an expertise in one area, they've been very successful in one area, there's this belief that they will then they must be very successful in another area that's completely unrelated. In Illinois, we had a lot of people who were very, very wealthy run for political office. They were great businessmen. They had no idea what they were doing in a political arena. So politics is a skill. And finding people who are good at it is not just as easy as finding someone who's successful in one area of life and thinking they'll be successful in this different area of life. So one of the things that you will have to acknowledge you're doing is you are capping out people who are good at that job. And we need people who are good at that job. The longer you serve as well, the more you understand, especially if you're a senator, how the very bizarre and arcane rules of the Senate work. You're going to guarantee that there's going to be a perpetual level of some kind of inexperience if you are capping people out. My other objection to it has always been, term limits already exist. Every 6 years, you have to vote whether or not you want to reelect your senator. Every 2 years, you have to vote whether or not you want to reelect your congressman, unless, again, they choose not to run of their own accord. Voters already have a chance to term limit anybody out. In most cases, they decide to return these people to office. That is the choice of voters. The race in 2020 between Biden and Trump is a race between two of the oldest people to run against each other and two of the most, or then go back to 2016, that was a race between the two most disliked presidential candidates in the history of the Gallup poll. But they ran through primaries. People had an opportunity to choose different people. They didn't choose different people. They chose those people. Like, this comes back to the, is it Mencken, that democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard? In a certain way, if people want to keep returning those people to power, that's what people want. I mean, I think there are a lot of concerns. I think Dan raises a very good point as well, that part of the problem is our increased partisanship and the way that you have a lot of people who feel they can't talk about very legitimate issues surrounding Joe Biden's capabilities and capacity as, an octogenarian, because it gives credence to some of the more hysterical and ridiculous Republican critiques of this man. And it comes back to the same problem that we have with a lot of things, that we can't have serious conversations about this stuff. But it's not a good situation. But I remain skeptical of the idea of term limits for those reasons.
So there's a few points here. It is true that people vote for these people. However, the polarization, I think, somewhat mitigates against that point in the sense that a lot of people voted for Biden because they were sick of Trump. If the Democrats had nominated someone significantly younger, a lot of people would have voted for that someone because they weren't Donald Trump. And I think so. I will say this: maybe the solution doesn't have to be constitutional, although. If we can have an age minimum, I still think we can have an age limit.
Well, I think we could absolutely do it.
So
I wonder about the problems.
Why not, right? And I'll get to that in a minute. But also parties could do this themselves, right? They could just say, look, you don't get to run in our primary if you are above this age. And then there you go. Now you're guaranteeing that your party is not going to have an octogenarian candidate or a septuagenarian candidate or something like that. As far as some of the statistics you cited, while I don't doubt their accuracy, it is important to note that life expectancy, especially if you go past, say, the mid-20th century or whatever, heavily skewed because of infant mortality. Also, the prevalence of vaccine preventable diseases. So there were plenty of grandfathers and grandmothers and great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers in the 18th century. It's just that the statistics skew.
That's why I wanted to note if you lived to be 50, you were likely to live into your 70s.
Right. And so I think that's worth pointing out. When they set that minimum at 35, I do not think they were thinking... They were thinking people maybe whose children had grown to a certain age. People had children younger, that sort of thing. So maybe you're not a newlywed at 35 in the 18th century for sure, right? For the most part. But I don't think they're thinking like, oh, death is knocking on your door and now, okay, you can be president, right?
I think the general point there is just that 35 in this late 1700s is a lot older than we think of 35
That's
now.
That's fair. But again, I would temper that a little bit. So I think that you go back and you'd be like, oh, I thought it would just all be young people and everyone would be dead. That's based on the statistics, and that's just not the case, right? So I think in the other direction. So parties can take the initiative on this. I would love. I realize, it's not going to happen, right? If Donald Trump is truly as popular as some of these polls say, and he has stated recently that he is planning to run in 2024, or at least heavily implied in the way that he does, and I don't think Republicans are going to say no to him if they think they can win again, just like they didn't say no to him the first time because they thought, well, I guess maybe we can win. That's too bad. I think there are a lot of people, a lot of talented Gen X politicians who I think are just never going to get their chance. I think we're going to go right from a boomer president to a millennial president. That's unfortunate, I think. I think we're going to miss out on the expertise of a generation in that leadership role because we have had boomer after boomer after boomer holding onto the position. On the other hand, I don't want to totally ignore the personal responsibility side that perhaps those Gen Xers should have campaigned better and beat out the septuagenarians. So, yes, to some degree, this does come down to how do people vote and what do people do. And maybe you don't need a limit and you just need people to make better decisions. But I am not a proponent of direct democracy precisely because I don't think people on the whole make good decisions. I think we have to find ways not to not let them make decisions, but to find ways to connect the decision-making with their interest and with areas in which they have the most leverage, right? So let's make elections as local as possible, right? If I vote for the drain commissioner, my one vote matters a lot more than my one vote for president of the United States because the pool of voters is so much smaller, right? That allows the drain commissioner not to declare a party, not to care about all the partisanship and polarization, right? But just to talk about what they're going to do about, the drains or whatever drain commissioners do, right? I mean, that there's something that improves the quality of governance when you can connect a person's interest, when you can make the vote matter more. And I think what we have right now is people are just voting against the stuff they don't like. And that's not at all serving their interests.
Yeah, I think to go back to the point about the toxicity of our times that Dan was talking about, I think I agree pretty much entirely with what you just said. The problem for your local, Dave, your local drain commissioner, is because we have focused so much and elevated so much of our questions about how we're going to govern ourselves to a federal level, I would fully expect that if you win and talk to Dave, your drain commissioner, that when he's campaigning, even though it's a small pool of voters, right, his focus is on making sure that the drains run on time. He is getting questions about whether he thinks the 2020 election was stolen. I promise you he is. And now that is an entirely different problem than what we've been discussing. It is a lot less to do with these questions about age and leadership and service and all of that. But it is a question about the political environment in which all of this is currently existing.
There's also a role for folks who age out of political life. And we see this historically with the presidency itself. Since these term limits have come into place, ex-presidents have a role. And they have a role as sort of elder statesmen who meet with and advise current presidents. They are sometimes sent on sort of diplomatic missions by those current presidents. And sometimes they do, excellent charitable and civil society work. So this conversation is not to say that elders have no role in American civic life.
Absolutely.
And that their wisdom is not valuable. It certainly is. And there's also a way in that by sort of aging out of that political process, you're able to do things you wouldn't, being enmeshed in partisan politics. And all of that, I think, is extremely valuable. There are many countries that have presidencies that are less, that they are more ceremonial than they are active in governance. And those countries often elect very senior, well-respected figures to serve those roles. And I think our ex-presidents and I think our elder statesmen can and should fulfill those sorts of roles in our public life.
Why don't here we transition to our second topic, which in a way we're already talking about because I want to talk about language, and we're using language to communicate. Something that came to my attention later last week was this piece by Charles Cook at National Review, which is I like Charles. I think he can be an incredibly funny writer. And this, I think, is Charles at his best. The headline is Jill Biden's, and again, some of this is going to be a question of how we're going to pronounce these things, Latinx inclusion luncheon fiasco. And fiasco is spelled F-I-A-X-C-O. And this is, I'll just give you the lead into this piece here from Charles Cook. Yesterday, Jill Biden spoke at the Latinx inclusion luncheon. And actually, wait a moment. What are the rules here again? The Latinx inclusion luncheon. What the hell is going on with that name? The stated purpose of the neologism Latinx is to remove the gendered part of the Spanish word Latino/Latina and replace it with something more inclusive. The obvious purpose of the neologism inclusion is to match the X that results from the degendered Latino in the following word, inclusion, even if inclusion itself isn't actually gendered. But what can explain the event organizer's failure to match this pattern in the final ungendered word, luncheon? And why, if the existence of gendered words is so problematic, didn't Jill Biden apply the same practice throughout her keynote speech? And this is all very silly stuff. I personally think that the most meaningful debate here is whether we're supposed to say Latinx or Latinx, which is what it looks like it should be pronounced as to me. But as I was thinking about this, you get the same kind of thing in different forms, where there's this enduring belief that if we could just change the way that we talk about things, it changes the underlying thing itself. I think you get some of this here with the Latinx stuff or Latinx stuff, where the motivation for this is the other debates that have been going on about the nature of gender and the gender binary. And that if we can remove the gendered words from these Romance languages, the implication I can only assume is people think that that will eliminate the gender binary in other areas of life and in those debates, that it will have an impact on it, changing the way we talk about it. I don't know that that follows. I think some of it you also see in political messaging where, you know, a perfect example of this kind of changing the way you talk about things is calling it the death tax. Changing the words you use to talk about things to change people's perception of them. Calling it the death tax rather than, I can't remember what it was previously called. It's just escaped my brain.
Tax.
The estate tax, yes. The death tax, right? It doesn't change the nature of the underlying tax itself, but it changes the perception of it. So I think there is something to it. You know, people were, again, issue polling is very difficult, but people were less opposed to the estate tax than they were to the death tax. So there is an impact on all of this. But I think there is something fascinating to me about this belief that if we could just change the way that people talk about these things, we'll actually change the underlying reality. And I just don't think that's true.
Latinx to me sounds like the next hit Marvel superhero. And Marvel, if you're listening, you can have it. I think it'd be a great way to add some representation to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But from polls I have seen, something like 90 to 95% of Latino people do not use Latinx or Latinx and find it annoying. In fact, basically anytime it trends on Twitter, I click on the tab just to watch all the Latino people being upset at all the white people generally who are using the term to try to be inclusive and instead are butchering the Spanish language. So this is an example where I do think the term affects perception, but not in the way intended, such as with death tax, which was supposed to turn popular opinion against the estate tax. It generally, I think, fails to appeal to a group of people that are a growing minority in the United States and becoming a more and more important one politically, although extremely internally diverse. Latino can mean Dominican or Mexican or South American of various sorts, and it's probably not the most helpful term. But it's the sort of thing that it right now, at least, is a political misstep. But at the end of the day, like, Spanish is a gendered language. People who speak Spanish know that the term Latino includes men and women. That's just how the language works. It's not meant to be a statement about gender at all in that sense. And so there is a weird, variety. We could, of course, there's an analogy to the transgender movement we could talk about, and the emphasis on language and, gendering people in different ways and that sort of thing. And the question of, can you change the nature of something with the language? And there were actual philosophical debates about this in the Middle Ages. They were the nominalists who said, things are what they are simply because that's what we call them, right? That it's really the name that makes the category. We call all these things human, and so that's what humans are. Not there are a bunch of things that we identify, and we need a name for that, right? And so we'll call them human. And they have this common marker that even if, I guess maybe the best reference I can think of is if you think of Romeo and Juliet, would not a rose smell just as sweet were it called by any other name? Yeah, it would, because it would still be a rose. We might call it something else, but its nature would not change. And that's really what the question is can you change the nature of a rose by calling it another name? Could a Capulet be a Montague if you called them such? That is the question.
So I think there are two sort of separate questions. There's the philosophical sort of nominalist realist debate. On that, I'm with the realists. But there's also a real sense in which words do have power. As Solomon said, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits. There is a way in which you see this clearly with the Latinx sort of debate, is you see some folks even folks who are Democratic Party activists are advising candidates not to do this language because this language has the power to alienate, and there is certain polling data that it shows it does alienate. At the same time, I think part of the strategy is if you can successfully bundle an ethnic identity and the statement of an ethnic identity to an egalitarian sort of gender philosophy, you have created a new sort of intersectional alliance or groups. There's a way in which this is not merely about addressing Latin peoples. This is a way of incorporating Latin peoples into a broader constituency of interlocking and interrelated identity groups that then you can build a coalition out of. So I think the language has power. The tongue can cut both ways. And I think, politicians are well aware of this. And these debates happen within. And not only is this a left-right debate, but this is a debate also that's happening within the left because they see, at least some folks on the left, see that the power here is actually primarily a power of alienation rather than one of empowerment and a way of building unity within their political coalition.
Most of these categories, and we were talking about generations previously, and my standard line on when we get into these conversations about millennials and Gen Xers and baby boomers and the silent generation, which is actually the generation that Joe Biden is a part of, is that these generational classifications are condescending, fairly arbitrary, and pretty stupid. They are only as helpful insofar as it goes. There are there's some ethos that knits together, I would agree, the baby boomers that knits together Gen Xers. But when you start getting into the point where, with every conversation about a grouping like that, just the same way that you have to draw a line for when someone is considered old enough to be served alcohol. When they're 21, they are. But when they're 20 and 364 days, we say that they aren't. And those lines are always going to look somewhat ridiculous to us. There is the theory of those generational designations is that, I'm a older millennial. The theory should be that I should have more in common with someone who was born during Bill Clinton's presidency than I should with somebody who was born 3 years earlier than me. So I think there's problems certainly in the way that we group these things. I think we also see that with regard to, again, talking about even set aside Latinx for a moment, the Latino vote. Latinos in Southern California and Latinos in Texas and Latinos in Florida and Latinos in the Bronx are very different people. And we obliterate these distinctions by grouping them all together into this identity politics category. I think this is one of the big problems of this identity politics categorization that we are very much obsessed with now. But in a way, in forcing these conversations about these identity politics categories, we have, in a way, reshaped the political conversations that we are having because we're talking about them through these vehicles of identity politics categories. So I think there is some evidence of the ability to affect the way we think about and conceive these things by the use of language like this. I don't know if that's necessarily the impact that people are wanting it to have. The gendered stuff, when you get what is more underlying the Latinx thing, I think with what I can't remember, I think it was you, Dylan, who pointed out that it's incredibly unpopular with people who actually would be otherwise classified as Latino. And there's the caveat we should add as well that, people do change the way they describe themselves over time. A lot of people who, when they're younger, might have described themselves as Latino, later on would describe themselves as white. So again, these categories are not as hard and fixed as people like to pretend that they are. But some of the other language, particularly surrounding the gender-related stuff, I think, benefits from being on its face absurd. This professor from Berkeley that was testifying before Congress last week and got in this tiff with Senator Josh Hawley used the phrase, people with the capacity for pregnancy, which just is so odd. And I think strikes people as such. Birthing person, the same way. It is a signaling device for very highly educated elite people to other very highly educated elite people. But, try next May sending your birthing person a card that calls them a birthing person and see what the reaction is. Nobody actually talks that way. So I think it benefits from some of these things just being absurd on their face and kind of funny.
I think, a lot of this, we're giving examples of it not working. And I think it's helpful to ask, well, what would work, right? You could say Latinos and Latinas if you want to be inclusive, right? Those are two real Spanish words, right? There are ways that you can get to the goal without alienating people, as Dan said. I think often about the slogan of the transgender movement of trans women are women. I just don't think that's a winning slogan. I do think transgender people have a legitimate public safety concern that a person who views themselves as a trans woman does not want to go into a men's bathroom. There's documented violence and, increased risk. So fine. Slogan should be trans women aren't men, right? They need their own space. But there's plenty of women out there with a history of sexual assault, other sorts of things. They don't feel comfortable with someone, whatever pronoun they prefer, having different equipment in the same bathroom. They don't feel comfortable with the possibility that someone could use that as a pretense, even if they're not actually in any way transgendered, to go into their bathroom, right? Now, it doesn't mean there's not, of course, laws against any of those crimes, as anyone will point out. But still, this is real, and we need to have a conversation about, well, okay, what do you want? They want to be, they don't want to be afraid when they go to the bathroom. I think that's a totally fair thing to want, right? They want to be secure. Is this going to get it for them? I think the answer is no. And I think it's unfortunate that they have, one way or another, coalesced around this language, that if we use this language, we can set the agenda, change the reality, whatever the case may be. In a liberal society, you just don't get everyone even agreeing on the same understanding of reality. And I hate to put it that way. It sounds a bit like Planned Parenthood versus Casey. I don't think that everyone gets to define reality in the sense that that's what makes reality, but we all disagree. And we need to live with one another, even when we sharply disagree. People should be able to go about in peace. And so part of that comes from being clear about how things actually are, but also being careful about that language and caring about the language we use, and even asking the question, so here's a better example. There are terms for different people groups that at one time were socially acceptable and now are not. It's okay to stop using a term if it is now offensive to the people to whom it refers. That's a reality that should be acknowledged, and the language should be changed to reflect that. So it is something worth talking about and thinking about more, I think, that yes, there may be a reality that we care about. We absolutely should defend that reality. Phrases like birthing person are at the very least awkward, right? If not, in a very real way, actually erasing womanhood from our vocabulary, which I think is an incredibly unfeminist thing for anyone who cares about that. So there's got to be some other way. right? Obviously, there's a problem that's trying to be addressed with that language. The solution isn't working. So what is the solution? Let's talk about it instead of just hammering again and again the same slogan and trying to push people out of a conversation rather than include them within it.
I think that the confusion that is engendered by a lot of this stuff is palpable. And I think the example that I thought of, and something that has always kind of baffled me, is you will see, especially for people who spend too much time on Twitter like us, the acronym BIPOC. Black, Indigenous, People of Color, or just the latter three letters of that, People of Color, which sounds like just a longer and slightly more awkward way of saying colored people, which I've been reliably informed, and I think we all realized a while back, is not what any of those people wish to be called, and that it has a very offensive ring to it. And yet we've brought it back, flipped the order of the words, put an of in there, and now it is the desired term. And this is where a lot of the political correctness debates drive me crazy, because there are clear examples, obviously, of stuff like this that is political correctness, quote unquote, that is cuckoo. And then there's also just a lot of it that is seeking for people to adjust to changing senses of what manners are. And if somebody wants to be called something or not be called something, the polite thing to do is to go along with that. And there's these different bigger picture conversations like I think we're having now.
So one of the issues here is language is something that is organic. It is the process of human action, but not the result of human design. And when people seek to police language as a way to determine the larger trajectory of the culture, as a way to shape that language, that engenders resentment, pushback. People rightfully feel that they're trying to be controlled because the object is to control people and to control conversations. And I think that that is something that is, nonsensical, because this is simply not how language works. Language is intensely contextual. We have the language that is used in a Harvard faculty meeting is not going to be the language used in Elk Rapids, Michigan. It's just not. And that is normal. And that reflects the diversity of human persons in the world, and that reflects the way that language functions. Now, there is a separate debate about what we owe each other with our language. And there's an entire commandment dedicated to this about bearing false witness. And if you dig into any catechism, it is broader than simply lying about someone in a court of law. It is more comprehensive than that. It focuses on, it includes detraction, it includes gossip, it includes all of these things. And St. Paul admonishes us all to let no corrupting talk come out of your mouth, but only such that is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. Our language should always be used for building others up, for coming to greater understanding, and it should never be weaponized either to control other people's expression or to degrade persons. And I think people on both sides of these debates often lose track of that in the heat that comes within them.
I think I can tie this together a little bit to our previous topic before we move on to the last topic we're going to discuss. And that is the incredibly important point that Dad made about language being an emergent phenomenon. And the linguist John McWhorter had a great point about this, that it's something that drives me crazy, which is, and one of the biggest culprits of it, to tie back to our previous topic, is Joe Biden. Joe Biden will frequently say literally when he means figuratively. But it is accepted now that literally doesn't just mean literally anymore. It is a kind of a punctuation to say that you are really serious about something. And as much as that may bother me, if I was to say that my head literally fell off when I heard that, you both would know that my head literally did not detach and fall off of my body. The important point is, do we understand each other when we're talking to each other? And the reason why I think a lot of the stuff that we've discussed that strikes us all as weird and bizarre isn't working is because when you say person with the capacity for pregnancy, if you run that through your brain enough times, you get it. But the moment you hear it, it just strikes you as bizarre in a way that, sadly, if I were to say literally when I mean figuratively, you would all know exactly what I was talking about the moment that I said it. Let's go to our last topic for today, Dylan. So you, along with Alex Salter, had a piece in the Wall Street Journal, very prestigious publication. Congratulations on that. Tell us what it is about, which I know at the beginning of it is, as we should note, a lot of people were predicting that we were going to see another inflation number in the 8s, and we got a 9.1. 9 times 9.1 inflation rate there. So pretty devastating news, and it connects to the piece that you and Alex wrote.
So, yes, inflation has not gone away, unfortunately. So myself and Alex Salter, who's an economist at Texas Tech, we wrote a piece on a Christian view of inflation, of currency stability, and that 9.1%, that is up from last month. It was 8%. As far as I know, wage growth has remained the same, so it's about 5%. So that means that even if you got a very generous raise, in a lot of cases, you have actually taken a pay cut over the last year. And so we analyze this mostly from a biblical point of view in terms of the moral side. So people might be surprised to learn, because it's in some of the books of the Bible, maybe not as often read. I don't know when the last time you guys have cracked open the book of Leviticus. I do like it, but I understand that maybe a lot of listeners, that's not the first place they turn. But in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, which includes Leviticus, there's actually 25 references to a shekel of the sanctuary. God commanded the people to have a standardized coin with a certain determinable weight, so that every transaction they could ensure that no one was being defrauded. And then similarly, we reference the James, the Epistle of James, where he talks about at that time, wealthy landed magnates, ripping off the workers, defrauding them in terms of their wages, withholding their wages or not paying them what they were promised. But basically, you combine these two things, and the lack of the former has led to the latter in the sense of monetary policy over the last several decades now. It's not a recent thing. We've been diluting our money supply. We've been effectively debasing the dollar. And that means that people are not actually being paid what their employers had agreed to pay them. That's not the employer's fault in this case. It is the government's fault, and particularly the Fed's fault. It's a sort of thing that, as you mentioned, and maybe you mentioned before the recording, people, of course, have been predicting, runaway inflation for years. There's a certain sort of person on the right who is very, very aware of this. I don't think they're wrong to have worried, especially in the last, say, 14 years or something like that since 2008. However, inflation is based on the value of money, and the value of money is no different than any other economic value. It is based on perception, and there can be a lag. It can be a matter of going beyond a certain tipping point. And I think that's what has happened in the last year or so, that we have really gone past that point. And up until that point, policymakers have been saying, well, we debased we increased the money supply, but the value of the dollar held pretty pretty well, 2% a year or something like that. So maybe we can just keep doing this. And so we'll keep doing it. We'll keep doing it. We'll keep doing it. And then we had a pandemic, and they kept doing it, but we lost a lot of production that usually was going along with it. And people had nothing better to do but actually be on the internet all day and read about it. And I think people have been more aware. And it just kind of all got compounded with several other issues. But it's the sort of thing that there is a biblical view of this is bad. There's a Christian view of this. It was just pointed out to me the other day. There in the Byzantine Empire, actually starting with the Emperor St. Constantine the Great, as we call him in the Orthodox Church, minted a coin called the solidus that for 700 years maintained its value almost without change. This is a Christian principle. When Christians were first in charge of minting coins, they did a lot of bad things when they were in charge of government in Christian Rome. I in no way would paper over that. But this is one thing they got right, and they took very seriously having a stable currency for the sake of justice. And one last aspect, for the sake especially of the poor and the marginalized in our economies. So there are ways to hedge against inflation. One of those is to have appreciating assets, like a house, for example. Another one is to have credit. So if you have a loan and you're paying back the loan has an interest rate, but if the interest rate is less than inflation, what you end up paying back is less than what you borrowed, right? So it's a way in which you're, weirdly, because you're borrowing, but you're actually kind of hedging against inflation in that sense. Well, people with bad credit, who are unbanked and they deal mostly in cash, tend to be poorer people. In fact, statistically tend to be minorities as well. And these people, whatever little savings they're able to make, in addition to their wages being depreciated, their savings are just being eaten up by bad policy. And these are the people going to the grocery store and saying, well, I guess I have to choose between, getting all the food I wanted and also getting toilet paper, or whatever. They're making these really tough decisions at the checkout. People who are trying to find ways to drive less to avoid that gas pump. There are things you can do. Sure, you can carpool maybe, but there's a lot of ways in which this just hits the least of these in our society, the absolute worst, and it's something we should take very, very seriously because of that.
I think that's absolutely right. The one thing that I would add would be assets in general, stocks, equity of any kind, housing. We've seen, the market has been more volatile, but we see in real estate, and people who are holding their wealth in real estate have been making out fine lately. Mm-hmm. A lot of people do not have the resources necessary to allocate their wealth in such a way to insulate them from these things. And this is something that I think everybody who does have that needs to keep in mind when they, a lot of people will dismiss these inflation concerns of it's a little bit more, or okay, gas prices are a little higher, but we've got this, what they will term, a climate crisis, and that this is actually a good thing, and you should just buy an electric car or these sorts of things. And there are a lot of people who do not have these options. They just do not. And this creates a very precarious situation for people who were in a precarious situation to begin with.
Before I was here at Acton, when I was at the Illinois Policy Institute, Illinois, for those of you who are not from Illinois, not familiar with the current state of Illinois, it's a failing state, more or less. There's over $250 billion of an unfunded pension liability. It's got huge problems. And you would think the ability to communicate to people and get them really exercised about these huge problems that the state has would be fairly clear and obvious and easy to do. And it turns out that it's actually not. And it's often the smaller things that get people a lot more worked up. And I have a perfect example for it that I think ties to what Dylan was saying. they implemented a penny per ounce tax on soda in Cook County, Illinois. And the amount of people yelling and screaming about that was deafening. And I think one of the reasons is because it's the kind of thing that's just can be very obvious to you if you're going to buy like a 32-ounce soda at a convenience store. You notice the extra 32 cents on there very easily. I think one of the other reasons too, there was some very goofy stuff about like, what actually fell under because it was like a sugary beverage. It wasn't soda because, this is the problem with public policy is that you have to define what these things are.
Soda and soda adjacent beverages.
Right. So like, yes, if you got coffee, no. But if you added sweetener, did you need to pay extra for that? If it was a Frappuccino from Starbucks, that's got sugar in it. It's a sugary-based beverage now, right?
Juice is loaded with sugar.
Exactly. So it applied to a lot more things than I think when you hear a soda tax, you think it would be applying to because you're just thinking soda. But I think one of the reasons that it really did get people angry is how regressive the tax is. That it hurts the people with the least who are the least of the least among us, who have the least in terms of money to be able to pay for things like that. And no, this is not – I don't think this turns into any kind of a blanket argument that becomes, then thus if all regressive taxes are bad. I don't think all taxes that are regressive in some way are necessarily bad and they should be evaluated on their merits, nor do I think it logically follows that all then thus progressive taxes would be good, especially because you play around with the rates of those progressive taxes by dividing people into categories again, which we talked about the problem of dividing up people into categories earlier. But I think it was one of the things that always bothered me about these smaller ways in which the state of Illinois tried to separate people from their hard-earned money. And it was because, in a way, it's the easiest ones to pass and enact, is to say what Illinois essentially is now doing. It suspended it. But it passed legislation that the tax on gasoline goes up a penny every year. And it's just, again, for people who have to drive a lot, that really starts to hurt. Yeah. And it is done, I think, really without much regard for people who do not have the money, the wealth, the assets to be able to pay for these things. And it is just done, again, with a mind of, well, it's easy for the people who are lawmakers who are passing it to pay for it. So it's easy for everyone else. I don't think there's enough consideration given to those kind of ticky-tacky little things and the impact that they have on middle class, lower middle class, working poor families.
Yeah, I think if I were a politician running for office, I would call current inflation policy a poverty tax to play on our death tax analogy earlier. And actually, I agree that not all progressive taxes are as well designed as others, but I actually am basically against almost all regressive tax. And I do think it effectively, inflation obviously is not actually a tax. Nobody's benefiting. Even, it's not like we're paying, that we try to pay for more public services, but it's just short-term gains for long-term loss.
Debt holders are benefiting.
Yes, although one of our points in a different article we wrote for Public Discourse a month or two ago is that interest rates adjust. So banks look at inflation. They're not dumb, right? So the interest rates go up when inflation goes up, and they adjust accordingly. So yeah, technically, if you have a lot of debt now, and then there's a huge spike in inflation, you benefit. But it's not this big shot in the arm that it was marketed as, that, you want to get more people, using their resources and borrowing and that sort of thing. Well, a little bit of inflation just to kind of grease the wheels is a good thing. Banks account for that. They're not idiots. Their business is managing money. They're not going to get that wrong. And so, again, it's the sort of thing that turns out to be a wash for the people who can deal with it at best. But for the people who can't, who once again are the poor among us, it's just something done at their expense with very little real payoff.
Yeah, it would be it would be true that inflating the currency to pay off a lot of debt would be a good strategy if nobody changed their behavior based on the fact that you're inflating the currency to try to pay off.
Right. Well, and if
debt.
you actually have the power to inflate the currency to then pay off your debt at a debased rate, you are stealing. That is what that is. That is theft. It is fraud. It is against another one of the Ten Commandments. And it's the sort of thing. I mean, there's passages which we quote that talk about debasing coins as an abomination to the Lord, right? Like, this is serious business. And it's not the sort of thing we should just play around with because some wonk told us that, well, you might be able to get this tiny marginal increase in, carrot and stick consumer behavior or whatever. The people who don't participate in that are the poorest among us, and they are always affected negatively. And I'm not clear personally that there's that much of a benefit for everyone else.
We will put that piece in the show notes for everyone to read, and we'll call it a wrap there for today. Thank you for listening to Act and Unwind. Again, if you're listening to this podcast on our website, please look in the show notes for where you will find a link to subscribe directly to Act and Unwind, or you can just search Act and Unwind on your favorite podcast app. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, 5-star reviews only, so that more people can find this show. Thanks to Dan, thanks to Dylan for the Acton Institute. This is Eric Kohn. We'll see you next week.